I learned the exact weight of injustice on a Tuesday afternoon in March when my mother looked me dead in the eye and said, "One life pays for another, Emma. That's how this works." My father stood behind her in the marble foyer of our Highland Park estate, hands in his pockets, jaw set like granite. "The family needs you to disappear for a while," he added, as casually as if he were asking me to pick up dry cleaning. My brother Nathan smirked from the winding staircase, his arm protective around Victoria's shoulders as she dabbed at manufactured tears. "You owe her this," he said, "after what you did." What I did? The words tasted like poison in my mouth because I hadn't done anything except exist in the wrong place at the wrong time, a convenient scapegoat for a tragedy I had nothing to do with. Victoria lost her baby, and somehow that became my fault, my burden, my punishment to bear. 3 years. They negotiated 3 years of my life away in exchange for family harmony, paid off the right people, manipulated the right statements, and I went to prison for a crime that never happened because in families like ours, truth matters less than image. The Texas Department of Criminal Justice doesn't care that you come from oil money or that your last name opens doors across Dallas. Inside those walls, I was just another inmate, another number, another woman learning to sleep with one eye open. I refused every single visit they tried to make. Every letter went unopened. Every phone call went unanswered. My mother came once a month for the first 6 months, standing on the other side of that scratched plexiglass like she was visiting a zoo animal, mouthing words I couldn't hear because I'd already walked away. My father sent his lawyer with release papers I needed to sign, documents that absolved the family of any responsibility, any connection to my incarceration. I signed them with a smile because I was already planning something they couldn't imagine. Nathan never came at all, which told me everything I needed to know about his involvement in putting me there. 3 years gave me plenty of time to think, to plan, to transform from the naive 24-year-old daughter who trusted her family into someone else entirely. The day I walked free, I wore the same clothes I'd arrived in, now 3 years out of style. The designer jeans hung looser on my hips. The silk blouse felt foreign against skin that had forgotten luxury. But my mind was sharp, honed by endless hours in the prison library where I'd studied law, finance, real estate, everything I'd need to understand the empire my family had built on my grandfather's wildcatting fortune. Nobody met me at the gates. I had expected that. What I hadn't expected was the lawyer waiting in a black Mercedes 50 yards down the road, a man I'd never seen before, with silver hair and expensive shoes. "Miss Emma Thornton," he said, extending his hand. "My name is Robert Chen. I represent your grandmother's estate." I stared at him because my grandmother had died when I was 19, 6 months before Victoria entered our lives like a hurricane in designer heels. "I don't understand," I said, though my heart was already racing with possibilities. "Your grandmother established a trust 5 years before her death," he explained, sliding a folder across the leather seat between us. "She was quite specific about the conditions for release. You've just met them." The trust was worth $47 million. $47 million that my parents had no idea existed because my grandmother, brilliant woman that she was, had hidden it so well that even their forensic accountants never found it. The conditions were straightforward and devastating in their simplicity. I could access the money only after serving time in prison for a crime I didn't commit, only after my family's true nature revealed itself, only after I proved I could survive their betrayal. "She knew?" I whispered, reading the personal letter she'd left, her handwriting still elegant even in photocopy. "She knew exactly what kind of people your parents were," Robert confirmed. "She'd seen them destroy her son, your Uncle David, years before. She wasn't going to let them destroy you without giving you the means to fight back." My Uncle David, the name nobody mentioned, the son who'd supposedly died in a car accident in Austin when I was 10. "He didn't die in an accident, did he?" I asked. Robert's silence was answer enough. I spent my first week of freedom in a boutique hotel in uptown Dallas, not the one my family frequented, but close enough to watch their movements. I cut my hair short, dyed it darker, bought new clothes that screamed money but whispered different money, old East Coast wealth instead of Texas flash. I hired a private investigator named Sarah Reeves, a former FBI agent who specialized in financial crimes and family scandals. I need to know everything, I told her over coffee at a place where nobody from Highland Park would ever set foot. Every deal, every affair, every secret they've buried. Start with Victoria. Sarah raised an eyebrow. Your sister-in-law? The one who lost the baby? I smiled, and it wasn't a nice smile. The one who claimed to lose the baby. I want hospital records, doctor visits, everything from the 6 months before the alleged miscarriage to now. And I want to know where she was the night it supposedly happened. The investigation took 3 weeks, and what Sarah uncovered made my blood run cold and hot at the same time. Victoria had never been pregnant. The entire thing was a fabrication, complete with fake ultrasound images purchased online and a carefully constructed timeline that fell apart under scrutiny. She'd checked into a private clinic in Houston the night of the supposed miscarriage, but the admission records showed treatment for a perforated ulcer, not pregnancy complications. The doctor who'd supposedly confirmed her pregnancy didn't exist. The medical records my family had used to send me to prison were forgeries. Good ones, but forgeries nonetheless. There's more, Sarah said, spreading photographs across the table between us. Victoria and your father. These were taken 2 months before she married your brother. The images showed them at a restaurant in Austin, his hand on her knee, her lips near his ear, the kind of intimacy that doesn't exist between a father and his future daughter-in-law. My father had bought Nathan a wife, or maybe Victoria had seen an opportunity and taken it. Either way, the transaction was a transaction, and I'd been the cost of keeping it secret. Why frame me? I asked, though pieces were already falling into place. Your mother found out, Sarah said, pulling up emails on her laptop. Your father's assistant made a mistake, sent a hotel confirmation to his home email instead of his private one. Your mother confronted Victoria directly, threatened to expose everything, destroy her before the wedding. Victoria panicked, came up with the pregnancy story, but your mother didn't believe her. So Victoria upped the stakes, claimed you'd pushed her down the stairs during an argument about Nathan. I remembered that night with perfect clarity. Victoria had called me, hysterical, begging me to come to the house because Nathan was working late and she was scared. Scared of what, she wouldn't say. I'd found her at the bottom of the staircase, clothes artfully disheveled, makeup smeared, playing the victim so convincingly that even I'd almost believed her. Almost. My mother knew I didn't do it, I said slowly. She knew because she knew about the affair. Sarah nodded. But your father convinced her that protecting the family name mattered more than protecting you. If the affair came out, it would destroy his political ambitions, tank Nathan's position at the company, make them all look like fools. So they chose Victoria's lie over your truth. They chose their image over your freedom. 3 years of my life traded for their convenience. 3 years of my youth, my innocence, my trust, all gone because I was expendable and the scandal wasn't. What about Nathan? I asked. Does he know? Sarah's expression said everything. He's known from the beginning. Victoria told him about your father before they got married, used it as leverage to ensure he'd stick with her story. He's the one who convinced your mother that sending you away was the best option, told her it would give everyone time to cool down, that you'd understand eventually. My baby brother, the one I'd protected from bullies in elementary school, taught to ride a bike, covered for when he snuck out in high school. He'd thrown me under the bus without a second thought. I started with Nathan because he was the weakest link, the one most dependent on family money and least capable of earning his own way. He worked at Thornton Energy as Chief Operations Officer, a title that sounded impressive but mostly involved showing up to meetings and signing documents other people prepared.
I bought a controlling interest in a small renewable energy company, then systematically undercut every contract Nathan was negotiating, offering better terms, faster timelines, more innovative solutions. Within 2 months, Thornton Energy had lost 4 major deals to my company, and the board was asking questions Nathan couldn't answer. I watched him squirm during a quarterly meeting I attended as a shareholder, his face red as he tried to explain why their traditionally dominant position in the Texas energy market was suddenly slipping. Maybe you should ask your operations chief if he's actually qualified for the job, I suggested sweetly, my voice distorted just enough by my new appearance that he didn't recognize me. Or maybe ask him where he was during business hours last Tuesday when he was supposed to be in Houston. Last Tuesday, Nathan had been at a hotel in Fort Worth with his assistant, a detail my investigator had documented thoroughly.
My mother was next because her social standing meant everything to her, more than money, more than family, more than truth. She sat on the boards of 3 major charities, chaired the annual Highland Park fundraiser, and considered herself Dallas society royalty. I created a shell company and started donating massive amounts to rival organizations, pulling focus and funding away from her pet projects. I befriended her enemies, the old money families she'd spent years trying to impress, and slowly, carefully, let slip details about the Thornton family's true nature. Not enough to trace back to me, just enough to plant seeds of doubt. I attended the same gallery openings, the same charity dinners, always in disguise, always watching as her influence waned. The Highland Park fundraiser she'd chaired for a decade suddenly had a new chair, someone younger, fresher, without the whisper of scandal. My mother's face when they announced the change was worth every penny I'd spent making it happen. Victoria was the one I'd saved for last, the architect of my destruction, the woman who'd looked me in the eye and lied so convincingly that even trained investigators had believed her. She'd built her life on that lie, turned herself into the tragic victim, the woman who'd lost a child and gained a family's sympathy. She did interviews about pregnancy loss, spoke at grief counseling centers, positioned herself as an advocate while living off my family's money and my father's guilt. I hired a documentary filmmaker, someone young and ambitious who specialized in true crime. I have a story for you, I told him over drinks at a bar in Deep Ellum, about a woman who faked a pregnancy, framed her sister-in-law for assault, and destroyed an innocent person's life to cover up an affair. I gave him just enough information to start digging, pointed him toward public records and witnesses who'd been paid to stay quiet but might talk to the right person. Then I waited. The documentary aired on a streaming platform 6 months after my release, and I watched it from my penthouse apartment overlooking downtown Dallas, a glass of wine in my hand and satisfaction in my heart. The filmmaker had done beautiful work, laying out the timeline, the inconsistencies, the fake medical records, everything. He'd found the doctor in Houston who'd treated Victoria for an ulcer, gotten him on camera confirming she'd never been pregnant. He'd tracked down my father's assistant, the one who sent that fateful email, and she'd spilled everything for the right price. The affair, the cover-up, the decision to frame me, all of it documented in high definition for millions to see. My phone started ringing within hours. Friends I hadn't spoken to in years, reporters wanting comments, lawyers offering to file lawsuits on my contingency. I ignored them all, except for one call from an unknown number that turned out to be Nathan. Emma? His voice cracked like he'd been crying, and I felt nothing but cold satisfaction. Is this really you? I'd let the documentary filmmaker use my prison photos, my mugshot, everything that would make the contrasts between who I'd been and what they'd done to me crystal clear. It's really me, I confirmed, my voice steady and strange even to my own ears. Did you enjoy the show? He made a choking sound. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know about Dad and Victoria, not at first. By the time I found out, you were already gone and they said it was too late to fix it, that bringing you back would just make everything worse. Lies upon lies, excuses piled on top of betrayal. "You knew I didn't push her," I said. "You knew, and you let it happen anyway." The silence stretched between us like the 3 years I'd lost. "What do you want?" he finally asked. "What will it take for you to make this right?" I almost laughed because there was no making it right, no undoing what they'd done, no returning the time they'd stolen. "I want you to tell the truth," I said, publicly. "I want you to admit you knew I was innocent, that you helped frame me, that you chose Victoria and Dad over your own sister." Another silence, longer this time. "They'll destroy me." Now I did laugh. "They already destroyed you, Nathan. You just didn't notice because you were comfortable." He held a press conference 3 days later, looking like he'd aged a decade in 6 months. He confirmed everything, admitted his role, implicated my father and Victoria in excruciating detail. My mother stood beside him, stone-faced, her social empire crumbling in real time as cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions. My father was notably absent, already lawyered up and preparing for the criminal charges that were inevitably coming. Victoria had disappeared entirely, fled to somewhere without an extradition treaty, or so the rumors said. I watched it all from my apartment, Sarah beside me with champagne and a satisfied smile. "You did it," she said, raising her glass. "You burned it all down." But I hadn't burned anything. I'd simply revealed what was already rotten, pulled back the curtain on the beautiful lie my family had constructed, let the truth do what truth always does when it finally gets free. The Texas Bar Association was investigating the lawyers who'd helped fabricate my charges. The DA's office had opened a criminal probe into my parents. Thornton Energy's stock had tanked, and creditors were circling. Everything my family had built on oil money and social climbing was falling apart, and I'd barely had to lift a finger. The real question, the one Sarah asked as we finished the champagne and watched the news coverage, was what came next. "You've got your revenge," she said. "You've got your grandmother's money. You could go anywhere, be anyone. What do you want, Emma?" What did I want? For 3 years, I'd wanted freedom. For 6 months, I'd wanted justice. But now, watching my family's empire crumble on live television, I realized I wanted something else entirely. I wanted to understand why. Why Victoria had been so willing to destroy me. Why my father had chosen an affair over his daughter. Why my mother had valued reputation more than truth. Why Nathan had been such a coward. The documentary had answered what and how, but not why. And that was the piece I still needed. "I want to talk to Victoria," I told Sarah. "Find her for me." Sarah's eyebrows rose. "You sure that's a good idea? The woman tried to bury you." I smiled, and this time it wasn't cold or calculated. It was curious. She didn't try, she succeeded, but she also freed me in a way she'll never understand. I want to know if she even realizes what she did. Finding Victoria took another month and cost a small fortune in investigator fees, but Sarah was thorough and relentless. She'd fled to Costa Rica, bought a small house in a beach town using money she'd apparently been hiding from my family for years. Smart woman, preparing her escape route long before she needed it. I flew down without telling anyone, hired a local guide who knew the area, and showed up at her door on a Thursday morning when the beach was empty and the sky was that particular shade of blue that only exists in Central America. She answered in yoga pants and a tank top, her hair longer and lighter, her face free of the designer makeup she'd always worn in Dallas. For a moment, we just stared at each other, and I saw real fear in her eyes for the first time. "Emma," she breathed, "how did you find me?" I pushed past her into the small, airy house that was nothing like the Highland Park mansion she'd left behind. "I have resources you can't imagine. We need to talk." She made coffee with shaking hands while I sat on her rattan furniture and studied the life she'd built in exile. Books on meditation, local art on the walls, a simplicity that seemed genuine rather than performed. "I never meant for it to go that far," she said finally, setting a cup in front of me. "The prison thing. I just needed your mother to back off, to stop threatening me. I thought they'd make you go away for a few months, maybe a year, just long enough for the story to die down. I sipped the coffee, which was actually quite good. But 3 years was fine too, apparently. Long enough for you to build your victim brand, write your grief memoir, become the face of pregnancy loss advocacy. She flinched. I didn't write a memoir. I pulled out my phone, showed her the Amazon listing. You didn't, but someone did, using your story, your name, your lies. Made quite a bit of money off it too. Funny how tragedy sells. She collapsed into the chair across from me, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. I was trapped, Emma. Your father, he had this hold on me, this power. He promised me everything if I married Nathan, said he'd make sure I never had to worry about money again. But then your mother found out, and suddenly the deal changed. Suddenly I had to be the perfect daughter-in-law, the tragic victim, whatever they needed me to be. So you chose me as your sacrifice? I said, and it wasn't a question. Why me specifically? Why not claim Nathan pushed you, or even my father? She laughed, but it was a broken sound. Because you were the only one who wasn't already corrupted. You still believed in family, in loyalty, in doing the right thing. They knew you wouldn't fight back, wouldn't believe your own family could betray you like that. You were the perfect victim because you trusted them completely. The truth of it hit me like a physical blow. She was right. Even as they'd arrested me, even as the trial had progressed, some part of me had kept believing they'd stop it, would admit the truth, would save me at the last moment. That naive faith had died slowly in prison, cell by cell, day by day. Do you regret it? I asked. Victoria looked out at the ocean, her profile sharp against the bright window. Every single day, but not for the reasons you probably think. I regret it because it didn't even work. Your father discarded me the moment I became a liability. Nathan blamed me for destroying the family. Your mother still hates me. I lost everything I was trying to protect and became exactly what I pretended to be, a victim of my own lies. We talked for hours, and somewhere in that conversation, I found something I hadn't expected. Understanding. Not forgiveness, never that, but a comprehension of the desperate calculations that had led her to make such a catastrophic choice. Victoria had grown up poor in a small town outside Houston, had clawed her way into the University of Texas on scholarships, had seen my father as her ticket to a life she'd only dreamed about. When that ticket came with conditions, with compromises, with moral lines to cross, she'd cross them because going back to poverty scared her more than losing her soul. I can't undo what I did to you, she said as the sun started to set, painting the beach in shades of orange and gold. I can't give you those years back, but I can testify if you're filing charges. I can tell the truth about all of it. The affair, the fake pregnancy, how they pressured me into framing you. I know it won't fix anything, but maybe it's something. I considered her offer, turned it over in my mind like a chess piece. The DA already has enough to prosecute my parents without your testimony. They doctored medical records, bribed officials, committed fraud on a massive scale. They're going to prison with or without you. She nodded, unsurprised. Then what do you want from me, Emma? Why did you come all this way? I stood, moved to the window, looked out at the ocean that represented her escape and her prison all at once. I wanted to see if you'd become the person you pretended to be, the victim, the survivor, the woman who'd learned and grown from tragedy. I turned back to face her. Have you? Victoria met my eyes, and for the first time since I'd known her, I saw something genuine there. I don't know yet, but I'm trying. I volunteer at a women's shelter here, help women who are actually fleeing abuse, actually need protection. I figure maybe if I can save someone else from making the choices I made, it might balance the scales a little. It wouldn't, of course. The scales would never balance, the debt would never be paid, but it was something, a small step toward redemption that she'd never fully reach. Keep trying, I said, heading for the door. And Victoria, if you ever come back to Texas, if you ever try to profit from this story again, if you ever use your fake tragedy to hurt anyone else, I will end you. Not legally, not publicly.
I'll just make sure everyone knows exactly who you are and what you did. Do you understand?" She nodded, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "I understand. And Emma, for what it's worth, you're stronger than any of us ever gave you credit for. You survived something that should have broken you, and you came out harder and sharper and more dangerous than we ever imagined. Your grandmother would be proud." I left without responding because she was probably right, and I wasn't ready to think about my grandmother yet, about the gift she'd given me that was both salvation and burden. The flight back to Dallas gave me time to think, to process, to figure out what came next now that the revenge was complete and the justice was being served and the truth was finally out there for everyone to see. My parents were facing criminal charges for fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. Nathan had lost his position at Thornton Energy and was rumored to be considering a plea deal. Victoria was in exile, living a small life that would never satisfy the ambitions that had driven her to such desperate measures. Everyone who'd hurt me was suffering, and I felt strangely empty about it all.
Revenge was supposed to feel sweet, wasn't it? Justice was supposed to bring closure. But all I felt was tired, hollowed out, like I'd spent so much energy on destruction that I'd forgotten how to build. Sarah met me at the airport with news that would change everything. "Your parents' lawyer called," she said, sliding into the driver's seat of her Audi. "They want to meet with you, both of them. No lawyers, no recordings, just a conversation. They're willing to admit everything, sign whatever you want, but they want to see you face to face first." I should have said no. Every instinct I'd developed over the past 3 years screamed that it was a trap, a manipulation, one last attempt to control the narrative. But the daughter I'd been before prison, the one who'd loved her family despite everything, she wanted to hear what they had to say. She needed the closure that revenge hadn't provided. "Set it up," I told Sarah. "Somewhere public but private. And yes, I know that sounds contradictory, but you know what I mean." She did. She always did. 3 days later, I walked into a private dining room at a restaurant in downtown Dallas, the kind of place where old money went to have conversations they didn't want overheard. My parents sat at a table by the window, looking smaller and older than I remembered. Prison was aging my father rapidly, and my mother's perfect facade had cracked, showing the fear and regret underneath. Neither of them stood when I entered, which told me everything about how far they'd fallen. "Emma," my mother said, her voice rough like she'd been crying, "thank you for coming." I sat across from them, my posture straight, my expression neutral. "You have 15 minutes. Talk." My father cleared his throat, and I noticed his hands were shaking. "We made a mistake," he started, and I almost laughed at the understatement. "We got caught up in protecting the family name, protecting our position, and we forgot that you were family too. We forgot that you mattered more than any of that." My mother reached across the table like she wanted to take my hand, then thought better of it. "I knew you didn't push her," she admitted. "I knew it was a lie, but your father convinced me that it was temporary, that we'd bring you home soon, that it was the only way to keep everything from falling apart. But then you refused to see us, refused to talk to us, and I told myself you must hate us anyway, so what did it matter?" What did it matter? 3 years of my life, stolen, and she justified it by deciding I probably hated them. The logic was so twisted, so self-serving, that I felt something break inside me, the last fragile connection to the people who'd given me life but taken my freedom. "You're not here to apologize," I said flatly. "Apologizing would require actually understanding what you did wrong, and you still don't get it. You're here because you want something from me." They exchanged a look, and my father nodded. "The prosecution has offered us a deal. If we allocate against certain other parties, testify about the lawyers and officials who helped us, they'll reduce our sentences significantly. But they want your blessing first, want to make sure you're okay with us not serving the full time." There it was, the real reason for this meeting. They wanted me to give them permission to escape justice, just like they'd wanted me to accept injustice 3 years ago. "No," I said simply. My mother's face crumpled. "Emma, please. Your father has a heart condition. Prison will kill him." "I'm not strong enough to survive in there." We know we hurt you. We know we can never make it right. But please don't sentence us to death out of revenge." I leaned forward, my voice cold and clear. "You sentenced me to 3 years of my life without a second thought. You chose your image, your ambition, your convenience over my freedom. Now you want mercy you never showed me? You want me to save you from the consequences of your own actions?" My father's face went red. "We're your parents. We gave you life, raised you, loved you." The laugh that came out of me was harsh and ugly. "You gave me life, then you taught me that family means nothing when money and power are at stake. You showed me that love is conditional, that truth is flexible, that innocence is expendable. Those are valuable lessons, actually. They made me stronger, smarter, more ruthless. So thank you for that. But don't ask me to save you now." I stood to leave, and my mother grabbed my wrist, her grip surprisingly strong. "What happened to you?" she whispered. "What did we turn you into?" I looked down at her, this woman who'd valued social standing over her own daughter, and felt a strange kind of pity. "You turned me into someone who survives, someone who doesn't trust, doesn't forgive, doesn't forget. You turned me into exactly what I needed to be to destroy you." I pulled my hand away and walked out, leaving them in that private dining room with their fear and their regrets and their desperate attempts to avoid accountability. Sarah was waiting in the car, and she took one look at my face and started driving without asking where we were going. We ended up at White Rock Lake, watching the sunset paint the water in shades of red and gold, and I finally let myself cry. Not for them, but for the girl I'd been, the one who'd believed in family and trust and justice. She was gone, replaced by this harder, sharper version, and I mourned her even as I accepted what I'd become. "They're going to take the deal," Sarah said quietly. "The DA called while you were in there. Your parents accepted the terms, which means they'll testify against everyone who helped them, and in exchange, they'll serve maybe 2 years instead of 10. I nodded because I'd expected it. The system protected people like my parents, gave them outs and deals and second chances they'd never given me. But at least everyone would know what they'd done. At least their names would be permanently associated with the scandal. At least I'd taken everything else from them first. "What now?" Sarah asked, echoing her question from months ago. And this time I had an answer. "Now I build something," I said. "Something good, something that helps people who've been where I was, women the system failed, families torn apart by manipulation and lies. I'm going to use my grandmother's money, use everything I learned, and I'm going to make sure no one else has to survive what I survived alone." Sarah smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her in months. "Your grandmother would definitely be proud of that." Maybe she would, or maybe she'd just be satisfied that her trap had worked, that I'd survived the tests she'd set, that I'd proven worthy of the fortune she'd hidden and the revenge she'd planned. Either way, I had $47 million, a new identity, and a mission that felt like the first real purpose I'd had since walking out of prison. The sun set completely, darkness falling over the lake, and I felt something shift inside me. Not healing, not yet, maybe not ever, but a sense of direction, of moving forward rather than just destroying what was behind me. "Let's go," I told Sarah, my voice steadier than it had been in 3 years. "We have work to do." We drove back into the city, past Highland Park where my family's mansion sat dark and empty, past downtown where my parents waited in their expensive prison, past all the places that had defined my old life. Somewhere in that drive, I realized I'd stopped thinking of myself as Emma Thornton, victim, survivor, the girl they'd tried to destroy. I was just Emma now, undefined by my past, but not imprisoned by it either. Whoever that Emma would become, whatever she would build or destroy next, that story was just beginning. But there was something else, something Sarah's investigation had hinted at, but never fully revealed. Something about my uncle, David, that my grandmother's letter had almost explained. I needed to know what had really happened to him, needed to understand why my grandmother had been so certain my parents would betray me the same way they'd destroyed him. "Sarah,"
I said as we pulled up to my building. "I need you to find out everything you can about my Uncle David's death, not the official story, the real one." She nodded slowly. "You think it's connected to all this?" I thought about my grandmother's cryptic letter, about the trust conditions that required me to be betrayed and imprisoned before I could access the money, about the careful way she'd planned my revenge before I even knew I'd need it. "I think it's the whole story," I said, "and I think what happened to me was just history repeating itself. Whatever Sarah found would probably break me all over again, reveal new layers of family betrayal that I wasn't ready to face. But I needed to know. I needed to understand. And more than that, I needed to make sure that if my Uncle David had been destroyed by my parents like I suspected, his story would finally be told. His justice would finally be served." The elevator doors closed on my reflection. A woman I barely recognized, harder and colder and more determined than she'd ever been. 3 years in prison had stolen my innocence. 6 months of revenge had stolen my mercy. Whatever came next would probably steal something else, some other piece of the person I might have been. But I'd survived worse. I'd survived my own family. Whatever truth was waiting in my Uncle David's story, I was ready for it. Sarah called at 2 in the morning 3 weeks later, which meant she'd found something big. I'd been having nightmares again, the kind where prison walls closed in and my family laughed from the other side, so I was already awake when my phone lit up. "You need to see this in person," she said without preamble. "My office, now. And Emma, bring whatever emotional armor you have left." I drove through empty Dallas streets, past closed shops and sleeping buildings, my mind already racing through possibilities. By the time I reached Sarah's office in a nondescript building near Love Field, I'd imagined and dismissed a dozen scenarios, none of them good. She had file boxes stacked on her conference table, old newspaper clippings spread across every surface, and a bottle of whiskey sitting between 2 glasses. "That bad?" I asked, pointing at the alcohol. She poured us each a generous measure. "Worse than bad. Your Uncle David didn't die in a car accident. He died by suicide in his apartment in Austin after your father systematically destroyed his life and stole his portion of the family business." The whiskey burned going down, but not as much as the truth. Sarah laid it out in chronological order, using documents she'd pulled from sealed court records, old police reports, and interviews with people who'd known my uncle. David Thornton had been the older son, the one groomed to take over Thornton Energy. Brilliant and ambitious, but also principled in ways that made him dangerous to people like my father. When my grandfather died, he'd split the company 60-40 between his sons, with David getting the larger share because he'd actually worked to build it. My father, younger and hungrier and more ruthless, had resented that split from day one. "Your father spent 5 years systematically undermining David," Sarah explained, showing me financial records that documented the slow theft. He'd make deals that benefited his shell companies, authorize expenses that went into his pocket, manipulate board votes to block David's initiatives. When David started investigating, started gathering evidence of the fraud, your father got desperate. The next part of the story came from police reports and witness statements Sarah had obtained through channels she wouldn't specify. My father had launched a whisper campaign, spreading rumors that David was embezzling, that he had a drinking problem, that he was mentally unstable. He'd manufactured evidence, just like he would later do with me, creating a paper trail that made David look guilty of the very crimes my father was committing. The board forced David out based on falsified audits and paid testimony. My grandmother, already ill with the cancer that would kill her a year later, believed my father's lies until it was too late. David lost everything in 6 months: his position, his reputation, his fortune, his family. Your parents spread the story that he'd moved to Austin to start fresh, Sarah continued, her voice careful. Truth was, he was living in a studio apartment, working as a bartender, trying to gather evidence to clear his name. But your father had covered his tracks too well, paid off everyone who mattered, and David couldn't fight back with no money and no support. The suicide note Sarah showed me next was brief and devastating. David had written it on a legal pad, his handwriting shaky but legible. To whoever finds this, I didn't embezzle anything. My brother did, and he destroyed me to hide it. I'm too tired to fight anymore. Tell my mother I'm sorry I wasn't strong enough. Tell my niece Emma that family isn't always what we think it is. I'd been 13 when he died. I remembered the funeral, remembered my mother crying beautifully, my father giving a speech about tragic accidents and the dangers of drinking and driving. All lies. My uncle had died sober, broke, and alone, murdered by my father as surely as if he'd pulled a trigger. My grandmother knew, I said, pieces clicking into place. That's why she set up the trust the way she did. She figured out the truth after David died, but by then she was sick, and she knew she couldn't fight my father directly. So she planned for the future, for when he'd inevitably do the same thing to me.
Sarah nodded. I found letters between your grandmother and her lawyer, written in the months before her death. She'd hired her own investigator, gotten proof of what your father did to David, but the statute of limitations had passed on most of it, and she knew going public would just destroy the family without bringing David justice. So she created the trust as a trap. If your father never betrayed you, you'd never need the money. But if he did, you'd have the resources to finish what David started. My grandmother had turned me into a weapon, a delayed action bomb designed to explode in my father's face decades after she'd planted it. The thought should have bothered me, being used like that, but mostly I felt grateful. She'd seen my father's nature clearly, had known he'd eventually destroy another child, and she'd made sure I'd survive it. There's something else, Sarah said, pulling out a manila envelope marked with my grandmother's familiar handwriting. She left video testimony, dated 2 weeks before she died. Her lawyer had instructions to give it to you if you ever accessed the trust, but only after you'd already started your revenge. He called yesterday to arrange the transfer. The video was 15 minutes of my grandmother sitting in her home office, looking frail but fierce, her voice raspy but determined. She started by apologizing for not protecting David, for believing my father's lies until it was too late to save her oldest son. Then she laid out everything she'd discovered about the fraud, the manipulation, the calculated destruction of a good man by a ruthless one. Emma, she said, looking directly at the camera, if you're watching this, it means your father has betrayed you too. It means he's proven himself incapable of change, incapable of love that doesn't serve his interests. I'm sorry I couldn't stop him. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you the way I failed to protect David. But I can give you the tools to fight back, to expose him, to make sure he never destroys anyone else. She paused, and I saw tears in her eyes. Your Uncle David was the best of us. He believed in honesty, in hard work, in building something meaningful. Your father couldn't stand that because it highlighted everything he wasn't. Don't make the mistake of thinking you can change him or redeem him. Some people are too broken, too corrupted by their own ambition. All you can do is survive them and make sure they can't hurt anyone else. The video ended with her giving me specific instructions about additional evidence she'd hidden, accounts she'd tracked, witnesses she'd identified who could testify about my father's crimes against David. It was enough to reopen the case, to prove fraud, maybe even to upgrade the charges against my father to include David's death. Not legally murder, but morally, absolutely. She gave you everything, Sarah said quietly. The money, the proof, the roadmap for complete destruction. Question is, what are you going to do with it? I thought about my Uncle David, the man I barely remembered but who'd apparently been more like me than I'd ever known. Principled, trusting, betrayed by the very people who should have protected him. He'd given up in the end, let the despair and exhaustion win. But I wouldn't. I couldn't, because I owed it to him to finish this, to make sure my father paid for both of us. We're reopening David's case, I said. All of it. We're going to prove what my father did to him, add it to the current charges, and make sure everyone knows that I wasn't his first victim. We're going to give David the justice he never got. Working with Sarah and a team of lawyers who specialized in cold cases, I spent the next 2 months building an airtight case against my father for fraud, conspiracy, and wrongful death. We tracked down the witnesses my grandmother had identified, many of whom still felt guilty about their roles in David's destruction. We subpoenaed records that had been sealed, convinced judges that new evidence warranted reopening old cases, systematically dismantled the wall of lies my father had built around David's death. The hardest part was reading David's journals, which his former landlord had kept in storage all these years, not knowing what else to do with them. Page after page of my uncle's thoughts, his confusion about why his brother would betray him, his desperate attempts to understand what he'd done wrong, his slow descent into hopelessness. I don't recognize my family anymore. He'd written 3 weeks before his death. The people I thought I knew, who I thought loved me, have turned into strangers wearing familiar faces. My mother looks at me with suspicion. My brother smirks when he thinks I'm not watching. My father's legacy, everything he built, is being perverted by greed and ambition, and I'm powerless to stop it. He'd been 28, the same age I was now. The parallel was almost too painful to contemplate. The DA's office initially resisted adding the old charges, worried about statute of limitations and proving intent across decades. But the evidence my grandmother had gathered was extensive enough to establish a pattern of behavior, and the current fraud charges against my father were serious enough that the DA was willing to expand the case. This changes everything, the lead prosecutor told me during a meeting in his downtown office. If we can prove your father killed your uncle, even indirectly, even through psychological manipulation and fraud, it shows premeditation and malice that goes beyond white-collar crime. We're talking substantial prison time, maybe 15 to 20 years instead of the 5 to 7 he's looking at now. 15 to 20 years. My father would die in prison. The thoughts should have brought me more satisfaction, but mostly I felt hollow, like I'd been carved out by grief for a man I'd barely known, and rage at the family that should have protected both of us. Do it, I told the prosecutor. Whatever it takes, make sure he can't hurt anyone else.
The trial became national news, one of those cases that captured public attention because it had everything: wealth, betrayal, suicide, a daughter seeking revenge for an uncle she barely remembered. I testified for 3 days, walking the jury through my own imprisonment, then connecting it to what had happened to David decades before. The defense tried to paint me as vindictive, a woman so consumed by bitterness that she'd fabricated a conspiracy theory to destroy her father. But we had the evidence, the paper trail, the witnesses, everything my grandmother had carefully preserved and Sarah had expertly assembled. The prosecution brought in psychological experts who explained patterns of narcissistic abuse, how people like my father viewed family members as tools to be used or obstacles to be removed. They showed how the tactics used against David, the reputation destruction, the financial manipulation, the manufactured evidence, were identical to what had been done to me. This isn't coincidence, the lead prosecutor argued in his closing statement. This is a predator who refines his technique over time. David Thornton was his first victim. Emma Thornton was his second. How many more would there have been if she hadn't found the courage to fight back? The jury deliberated for 4 days, which felt like 4 years. I spent that time in my apartment, unable to work or sleep or think about anything except the possibility that my father might go free, that all of this might have been for nothing. Sarah stayed with me, forced me to eat, reminded me that I'd already won in the ways that mattered. I'd survived. I'd exposed the truth. I'd built a new life and a new purpose. Whatever the jury decided couldn't take that away. When the verdict came in, we were in the courtroom within 20 minutes, sitting behind the prosecution table as my father was led in wearing an orange jumpsuit that looked obscene against his usually impeccable appearance. My mother was in the back row, looking like a ghost of herself. Nathan hadn't come at all. The jury foreman stood, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a steady voice, and read out guilty verdicts on every single count: fraud, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and the big one, wrongful death through psychological manipulation and financial abuse. My father's face went white, then red, then crumpled completely as the judge announced a sentence of 18 years with no possibility of parole for the first 10. I didn't feel triumph or joy or satisfaction. I felt tired, wrung out, like I'd been carrying an enormous weight and had finally set it down, but couldn't quite remember how to stand upright without it. "It's done," Sarah whispered, squeezing my hand. "It's finally done." But it wasn't, not quite. My mother still faced trial on the reduced charges she'd taken a plea deal for, 2 years for her role in my false imprisonment. Nathan had lost everything but his freedom, working now as a car salesman in Austin, his MBA and family connections worth exactly nothing once the scandal broke. Victoria remained in Costa Rica, sending me occasional emails that I never answered, updating me on her volunteer work like it might somehow earn forgiveness it never would. The trial had exposed everything, destroyed my family's reputation completely, left the Thornton name associated with corruption and betrayal, rather than oil money and social standing. People I'd known my whole life crossed the street to avoid me now, unsure whether to treat me as victim or villain, uncomfortable with the messy reality that I was probably both.
3 months after the verdict, I sat in my office at the Emma Thornton Foundation, the nonprofit I'd established to help women who'd been failed by the justice system, and finally read the last letter my grandmother had left. Sarah had given it to me after the trial, said I should wait until everything was finished before opening it, and she'd been right. "My dearest Emma," it began in my grandmother's elegant script, "if you're reading this, you've survived the test your father set for you, just as David could not survive his. I'm sorrier than I can express that I left you to face him alone, but I couldn't protect you from the grave any more than I could protect your uncle while I lived. What I could do was give you the tools to save yourself, to be stronger and smarter and more ruthless than he ever expected. By now you know what happened to David, how your father destroyed him piece by piece until there was nothing left worth saving. David was kind and trusting, beautiful qualities that became fatal weaknesses in our family. You have those same qualities, Emma, but you also have something David lacked, a survivor's instinct, a core of steel that won't break no matter how much pressure it's under." The letter continued with my grandmother explaining why she'd structured the trust the way she had, why she'd required me to be betrayed and imprisoned before I could access the money. "I needed you to see your family's true nature," she wrote. "Not through my words or accusations, but through their actions when they thought you were helpless. I needed you to experience the worst they could do, to understand that there's no redemption waiting for them, no reconciliation possible with people so fundamentally broken. Only then would you have the strength to do what David couldn't, survive them, expose them, and build something better from the ruins they left behind." She was right, of course. If I'd gotten the money earlier, if I'd had the option to flee or hide or pretend everything was fine, I might have taken it. I might have convinced myself that family meant something, that blood ties obligated forgiveness, that time could heal what my father had broken. Prison had burned all those illusions away, left me with only the hard truth that some people don't deserve second chances, that protecting yourself means cutting out the cancer, even when it shares your DNA. "I watched your father destroy his brother," my grandmother continued, "and I did nothing because I was sick and scared and foolish enough to believe that losing one son would teach him not to hurt another. I was wrong. Predators don't learn. They just get better at hiding their nature until they feel safe enough to strike again. So I'm asking you to do what I couldn't. End this cycle. Make sure your father can never hurt anyone else. Make sure the Thornton name becomes a cautionary tale instead of a dynasty. And most importantly, make sure that the money your grandfather built on honest work gets used to help people rather than destroy them. Be the Thornton we should have been, Emma. Be the legacy David deserved. Be strong enough to survive and kind enough to help others do the same. That's all I ask, and I know you'll do it because you already have. I see that strength in you, that fierce determination to survive no matter what. It's the best gift I could have given you, even though it came wrapped in trauma and pain. I love you, my darling girl. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you better, but I'm also proud beyond measure that you protected yourself. I cried reading it, finally letting myself grieve for everything that had been lost. My innocence, my family, my uncle I'd never really known, even my grandmother who'd loved me enough to turn me into a weapon. Sarah found me an hour later, still sitting at my desk with the letter clutched in my hands. "You okay?" she asked, which was a ridiculous question, but I appreciated the gesture. "I will be," I said, and meant it. Eventually. The foundation had already helped 43 women in its first 3 months, providing legal support, housing assistance, and counseling for women who'd been imprisoned for crimes they didn't commit, or whose cases had been compromised by corruption or family manipulation. We'd gotten 12 wrongful convictions overturned, helped 25 women rebuild their lives after release, provided expert testimony in 6 ongoing cases. It wasn't enough to balance what had been done to me or David, but it was something, a purpose, a legacy that honored his memory better than any gravestone. "Your uncle would be proud," Sarah said, reading my thoughts like she always could. "Your grandmother, too." I nodded, carefully folding the letter and putting it in my desk drawer where I could read it again when I needed the reminder that I'd been forged in fire for a reason. "I'm going to visit his grave tomorrow," I told Sarah. I never did properly, not since I understood what really happened to him. I think I owe him that. David's grave was in a small cemetery outside Austin, far from the family plot in Dallas where my grandparents were buried. Even in death, my father had ensured his brother remained excluded, marked as an embarrassment rather than a son. The headstone was simple, just his name and dates with no mention of family or legacy. I'd ordered a new one, something that told the truth. David Thornton, beloved son and brother, destroyed by greed but remembered for his integrity. His story will not be forgotten. It would be installed next week, a small correction to the historical record. I sat by the old stone for an hour, telling him everything that had happened, updating him on the trial results and the foundation, and my hope that his suffering had finally meant something. "I'm sorry I didn't know you better," I said to the cold granite. "I'm sorry we didn't get the chance to be allies against them. But I finished what you started, Uncle David. I made sure they couldn't hurt anyone else. I hope that brings you some peace, wherever you are." The wind picked up, rustling through the live oaks, and I chose to interpret it as acknowledgement, as his spirit, or memory, or whatever remained, telling me I'd done enough. My mother's trial was anticlimactic compared to my father's. Circus. She pleaded guilty to conspiracy and obstruction, accepted her 2-year sentence with the kind of dignity she'd always prized, and disappeared into the federal prison system without any of the drama that had characterized my father's case. I didn't visit her, didn't write, didn't accept her attempts at communication. Some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt, and I'd poured enough gasoline on this one to ensure it would never support weight again. Nathan reached out once, a long email full of apologies and explanations and justifications that I deleted without reading past the first paragraph. He'd made his choices, lived with the consequences, and whatever redemption he sought wasn't mine to grant. The only family member I maintained any contact with was a cousin on my mother's side who'd reached out after the trial, a woman named Caroline who'd been estranged from our family for years over her own conflicts with my parents. "They're poison," she told me over coffee in a small shop in Fort Worth. "I tried to warn people years ago, but nobody wanted to hear it. Everyone thought I was just jealous or difficult. Now they know I was right." We bonded over shared trauma, compared notes on my parents' manipulation tactics, and slowly built something that might eventually resemble family, though neither of us used that word yet. A year after the verdict, I stood at a podium in a hotel ballroom in Houston, addressing a conference on wrongful convictions and systemic justice reform. The Emma Thornton Foundation had expanded to 3 states, helped over 200 women, gotten 37 wrongful convictions overturned. The work was exhausting and heartbreaking and occasionally triumphant. everything I needed to feel like my own suffering had purpose. "I'm not going to lie to you," I told the crowd of activists, lawyers, and formerly incarcerated women, and say that what happened to me was a gift or that I'm grateful for the experience. It wasn't, and I'm not. What happened to me was an injustice, a betrayal, a theft of years I'll never get back. But I survived it, and in surviving, I learned things I wish I didn't have to know. I learned that justice isn't guaranteed, that family doesn't always mean safety, that the system is designed to protect the powerful and discard the vulnerable. And I learned that the only way to fight back is to become stronger than what tried to destroy you, to build something better from the ashes they left behind. The applause was thunderous. Hundreds of women who'd survived their own hells recognizing a kindred spirit. After the speech, I met with dozens of them individually, hearing their stories, offering what help and hope I could. A woman from San Antonio who'd served 8 years for her husband's crimes. A mother from El Paso who'd lost custody of her children based on falsified evidence. A teenager from Corpus Christi who'd been trafficked and then prosecuted as a criminal instead of protected as a victim. Each story was unique and devastating, and proof that what happened to me wasn't an aberration, but part of a much larger pattern of systemic failure. Sarah joined me for dinner that night at a restaurant overlooking Buffalo Bayou, the lights of Houston sparkling like promises in the darkness. "You've built something incredible," she said, raising her wine glass in a toast. "Your grandmother and uncle would both be proud." I clinked my glass against hers, feeling something that might eventually become pride myself. I just wish they were here to see it, to know that their suffering wasn't meaningless, that it led to something that's helping people. Sarah smiled, that warm expression that had become as familiar as my own reflection over the past 2 years. "They see it, wherever they are, whatever form that takes. They see it and they know. You honored them the best way possible by surviving and then helping others survive too." We ate in comfortable silence for a while, watching the city lights reflect off the dark water, and I let myself imagine a future that wasn't defined by revenge or justice or fighting. A future where I could just exist, maybe find some kind of peace, build relationships that weren't forged in trauma. "What about you?" Sarah asked. "The foundation's established, your family's been held accountable, your uncle's story has been told. What does Emma Thornton do next?" The question lodged in my chest like a splinter because I honestly didn't know. I'd spent 3 years in prison planning revenge, 2 years executing it, and another year building something constructive from the ruins. What came after that? Who was I without the mission that had defined me since my release? "I guess I figure out who I am now," I said slowly. "Not the victim, not the avenger, not even the survivor. Just Emma, whoever that is." Sarah nodded like she understood, and maybe she did. "You could start by actually taking a vacation. Remember those? Time off where you don't work or plot or strategize. Just exist for a while and see what that feels like." The idea was terrifying and appealing in equal measure. When was the last time I'd done something just for pleasure, just because I wanted to, not because it served some larger purpose? "Where would I even go?" I asked. Sarah laughed. "Anywhere but Texas. Go see the ocean, climb a mountain, visit cities you've never been to. Remind yourself that the world is bigger than the damage that was done to you here." 3 weeks later, I was standing on a beach in Maine, watching waves crash against rocky outcroppings and feeling more at peace than I had in 4 years. I'd rented a cottage for the month, brought nothing but books and notebooks and a laptop I'd promised myself I'd only use for personal writing, not foundation work. The solitude was disorienting at first, the lack of purpose or direction making me anxious and restless. But gradually, day by day, I started to relax into it, to remember what it felt like to just be present without constantly strategizing or planning or defending. I walked the beach every morning, wrote in my journal every afternoon, cooked simple meals and read novels and watched the sunset paint the sky in colors that had nothing to do with revenge or justice or pain. Slowly,
Carefully, I started to separate my identity from my trauma, to find pieces of the person I'd been before prison and the person I wanted to become after everything else. I thought about my grandmother's letter, her hope that I'd be strong enough to survive and kind enough to help others do the same. I'd managed the strong part, the survival and the revenge and the building of something meaningful. But the kind part, that was harder. Kindness required vulnerability I wasn't sure I had anymore, trust that had been systematically destroyed, openness to hurt that I'd trained myself to avoid. One morning, near the end of my stay, I woke up early and walked to a secluded cove I'd discovered during my explorations. The tide was out, revealing tide pools full of tiny ecosystems, whole worlds existing in miniature. I crouched beside one, watching a small crab navigate around anemones and starfish, and had a sudden, visceral understanding of what my grandmother had meant. I'd been that crab once, small and vulnerable in a hostile environment controlled by larger, more dangerous creatures. But I'd survived by becoming harder, by growing my own armor, by learning when to hide and when to fight. The question now was whether I could stay soft enough inside that armor to still connect with people, to build relationships based on something other than shared trauma, to be more than just a survivor. The crab skittered under a rock, disappearing from sight, and I laughed at the metaphor. Even nature was telling me to stop hiding, to come out from under the protective walls I'd built, to risk being seen and known and possibly hurt again. It was terrifying advice, but probably necessary. Back in Dallas, I scheduled lunch with Caroline, the cousin who'd reached out after the trial. We'd maintained sporadic contact over the past year, trading emails about family drama and foundation work, but hadn't really connected beyond surface pleasantries. Over salads at a cafe in Bishop Arts, I asked her the question that had been bothering me since Maine. How do you trust people again after family betrays you? How do you open yourself up to relationships when the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally destroyed you? Caroline considered this, stirring her iced tea thoughtfully. I don't think you ever trust the same way again, she said honestly. The innocence is gone, the assumption of good intentions. But that doesn't mean you can't build new kinds of trust, more cautious, but also more honest. You just have to accept that some people have proven they don't deserve it and stop wasting energy hoping they'll change. She told me about her own journey away from our family, how she'd been cut off at 23 for refusing to accept my father's business decisions that she knew were unethical. They framed it like I was the problem, like I was too judgmental or idealistic or naive. But I was just unwilling to compromise my values for money. Your father called me self-righteous. Your mother said I was throwing away my inheritance over nothing. But it wasn't nothing. It was the difference between being able to look at myself in the mirror and becoming someone I'd hate. That conversation sparked something in me, a recognition that I didn't have to rebuild trust exactly as it had existed before. I could create new standards, new boundaries, new ways of connecting that acknowledged reality without succumbing to total cynicism. I started having regular dinners with Caroline, building a friendship that felt authentic because it was based on honest acknowledgement of our family's toxicity, rather than pretense of normalcy. I slowly let Sarah deeper into my life, allowed our professional relationship to evolve into real friendship, spent time with her family and met her friends, and reminded myself that not everyone was secretly plotting my destruction. I even went on a few dates, awkward coffee meetings with people who had no connection to my past, no knowledge of the scandal beyond what they might have read in newspapers. None of them turned into relationships, but the practice of vulnerability, of presenting myself as someone with depth and interests beyond trauma, that was valuable in itself. I was relearning how to be human, how to exist in the world as something other than a weapon or a victim. The foundation continued growing, expanding to 5 states and helping over 500 women in its second year of operation. We developed innovative legal strategies for challenging wrongful convictions, created support networks for women leaving prison, lobbied for policy changes that would prevent the kind of systematic abuse I'd experienced.
It was exhausting work, emotionally draining work, but it also provided a sense of purpose that went beyond personal revenge. Every woman we helped was a small victory against a system that had failed me. Every conviction we overturned was proof that justice could still prevail even when it came slowly and imperfectly. I hired a team of incredibly capable women to manage day-to-day operations, freeing myself up to focus on strategy and big-picture planning. Delegation had been hard at first, trusting other people to care about this work as much as I did, but gradually I learned that I couldn't build something sustainable if it depended entirely on my personal involvement in every detail. The foundation needed to be bigger than me, more resilient than my individual rage and grief. It needed to outlast my need for revenge and continue helping people long after my own wounds had scabbed over. On the 5-year anniversary of my release from prison, I organized a gala fundraiser for the foundation, a black tie event at a hotel in downtown Dallas that drew 500 guests and raised over $3 million. Standing at the podium to give the keynote address, I looked out at the crowd and saw people from every phase of my journey. Lawyers who'd worked on my case, women we'd helped through the foundation, donors who believed in the mission, even a few journalists who'd covered the trial fairly. My parents weren't there, obviously. My father was still in federal prison with 8 years left on his sentence. My mother had been released after 18 months for good behavior and had moved to Arizona, living quietly under her maiden name, all her social ambitions reduced to nothing. Nathan wasn't there either, though I'd heard he'd gotten married to someone who knew nothing about his past, started over in a different city with a different name. I felt no satisfaction in their absence, no triumph in their downfall. Just a quiet acknowledgement that some endings are messy and unsatisfying, that real closure comes from internal peace rather than external validation. 5 years ago, I told the crowd, I walked out of prison carrying nothing but rage and a hunger for justice. I'd lost 3 years of my life to a lie, been betrayed by the people who should have protected me, learned the hardest way possible that family doesn't always mean safety. I paused, gathering my thoughts, feeling the weight of 500 pairs of eyes on me. But I also learned that survival is its own form of victory, that building something positive from trauma is the best revenge, that helping others heal can begin to heal yourself. The Emma Thornton Foundation exists because my grandmother saw my family's true nature and gave me the tools to fight back. It exists because my Uncle David couldn't survive what was done to him, and I refused to let his suffering be meaningless. It exists because I survived, and I decided that survival wasn't enough. I wanted to thrive, to build, to make sure no other woman had to walk the path I walked alone. The applause was long and loud, but I raised my hand for quiet. I won't stand here and tell you that everything happens for a reason or that I'm grateful for what was done to me. I'm not. I'm angry about it still. Probably always will be on some level. But I've learned to channel that anger into something constructive, to let it fuel purpose instead of consuming me. That's what this foundation represents, the choice to build rather than destroy, to help rather than hurt, to create light instead of spreading darkness. After the gala, I stood on the hotel balcony with Sarah and Caroline, the three of us exhausted but satisfied, watching the Dallas skyline glitter against the night. "You did it," Caroline said, echoing Sarah's words from years before. "You survived them, exposed them, and built something incredible from the ruins. That's the ultimate revenge." I nodded, but something still felt incomplete, a nagging sense that the story wasn't quite finished. "There's one more thing I need to do," I said. Both women looked at me with concern. "Please tell me you're not going after Nathan," Sarah said. "He's already lost everything that matters." I shook my head. "Not Nathan. Victoria. I need to actually forgive her, not just pretend to move on. She's the only one who showed any real remorse, any genuine attempt to change. If I can't find forgiveness for her, then I'm just perpetuating the cycle of hatred that destroyed my uncle and almost destroyed me." Caroline frowned.
You don't owe her forgiveness. She put you in prison, Emma. She lied and manipulated and destroyed your life for her own gain. She was right, of course. I didn't owe Victoria anything, but the weight I'd been carrying, the hardness I'd cultivated for protection, it was starting to feel like a prison of its own. If I wanted to truly move forward, to be more than just a survivor or an avenger, I needed to prove to myself that I was capable of mercy.
You're right that you don't deserve it, I agreed. You destroyed me, framed me, sent me to prison for 3 years for a crime that never happened. But you're also the only person in my family who showed actual remorse, who tried to change, who didn't just protect yourself when everything fell apart. That matters, Victoria. Not enough to erase what you did, but enough that I can let go of the hatred. She cried then, really cried, the kind of tears that come from years of guilt and shame finally finding release. I think about you every day, she said when she could speak again. Wonder how you survived, what kind of person I turned you into, whether you'd ever be able to move past what I did. I wake up at night sometimes, trapped in nightmares where I'm the one in prison and you're on the outside smiling. I thought about my own nightmares, the prison dreams that still visited occasionally, and felt an unexpected pang of empathy. We both built our own prisons, I said. Mine had walls and bars. Yours is made of guilt and exile and the knowledge that you destroyed someone for no good reason. I'm choosing to leave mine. Whether you can leave yours is up to you. We talked for hours, working through the events that had led to my imprisonment from both perspectives. She explained the desperation that had driven her, the fear of losing everything she'd worked for, the way my father had manipulated her into thinking framing me was the only solution. I explained the rage and the planning and the satisfaction of watching my family's empire crumble, the hollowness that revenge had left behind. Neither of us justified or excused what had been done, but we both acknowledged the humanity underneath the terrible choices. I'm not asking to be friends, I told her as the sun started to set, painting the beach in shades of gold and orange. I'm not asking for a relationship or even regular contact. I just needed you to know that I'm choosing not to hate you anymore, choosing to release the anger that's been eating me alive for 5 years. You have to live with what you did, and that's punishment enough. Victoria nodded, understanding that this was closure, but not reconciliation. Thank you, she said simply, for surviving, for building something good, for being strong enough to forgive even when I don't deserve it. You're the best of us, Emma. You're what we all should have been. Flying back to Dallas, I felt lighter than I had in years, like I'd finally set down the burden I'd been carrying since that Tuesday afternoon when my mother had looked me in the eye and sentenced me to prison. Forgiveness hadn't erased the damage or made the past acceptable, but it had released me from the obligation to keep feeding my anger, to keep it alive and burning. I could finally let it fade to an ember, still present but no longer consuming. Sarah picked me up from the airport, took one look at my face, and smiled. You did it, she said. You let it go. I nodded, allowing myself to lean on her shoulder as we drove through familiar streets. Not all of it. I'll never forget what they did or stop working to help people like me, but I released the need to make them suffer, to keep punishing them forever. They'll live with their consequences, and I'll live with mine, and maybe that's enough. That night, I pulled out my journal and wrote a letter to my Uncle David, something I'd started doing occasionally when I needed to process difficult emotions. Dear Uncle David, I wrote, I've done everything I can to get you justice, to make sure your story is told, to prevent your death from being meaningless. I've forgiven the one person who showed remorse and refused forgiveness to those who didn't. I've built something good from the ruins of our family, something that helps people the way no one helped us. I hope that's enough. I hope you're at peace, wherever you are. I hope you can finally rest knowing that what was done to you has been acknowledged, punished, and transformed into something positive. I'm going to try to rest too, Uncle David. I'm going to try to be more than just the person they tried to destroy. I'm going to try to be happy. The years that followed were quieter, less dramatic, focused on growth rather than revenge or justice. The foundation continued expanding, eventually operating in 12 states and helping thousands of women. I dated seriously for the first time, a relationship with a professor of social work who understood trauma without needing me to explain it, who could hold space for my darkness without trying to fix it. We didn't get married, but we built something steady and honest, a partnership based on mutual respect rather than need or obligation. I reconnected with old friends I'd lost touch with during my imprisonment, carefully rebuilding a social life that had nothing to do with my family or the scandal. I traveled, saw parts of the world that had nothing to do with Texas or my past, reminded myself that I was more than my trauma and my victory over it. And slowly, year by year, I became someone I recognized and mostly liked, someone who'd survived the worst and come out not just intact, but maybe even better for it in some strange ways. On the 10th anniversary of my release, I stood at my Uncle David's grave again, this time with Sarah and Caroline beside me. The new headstone I'd ordered years ago had been weathered by time, the inscription still clear but softened by rain and sun. David Thornton, beloved son and brother, destroyed by greed but remembered for his integrity. His story will not be forgotten. Below that, I'd had them add a new line last year. The Emma Thornton Foundation stands as his legacy. It wasn't enough, could never be enough, but it was something. I laid flowers on the grave, white roses that represented new beginnings rather than endings. I kept my promise, Uncle David, I said quietly. I made sure you weren't forgotten. I made sure your suffering meant something. I hope that wherever you are, you found the peace they denied you in life. Caroline squeezed my shoulder. He'd be proud of you. Hell, I'm proud of you. You took the worst thing that ever happened to you and turned it into the best thing that ever happened to hundreds of other women. Sarah nodded agreement. You didn't just survive, you transformed. That's the real victory, Emma. Not destroying your family, not getting revenge, but becoming someone who helps instead of hurts, who builds instead of destroys, who chose light even after spending so long in darkness. That evening, the three of us had dinner at a restaurant overlooking White Rock Lake, the same place Sarah and I had come the night of my parents' press conference all those years ago. So much had changed since then, but the lake was still there, still peaceful, still reflecting the sky in shades of blue and gold. What now? Sarah asked, that familiar question that had guided me through so many transitions. I thought about it, really thought about it, what I wanted for the next phase of my life. Now, I live, I said simply. Not just survive, not just build something or help people or maintain the foundation. Actually live, have relationships, take risks, be vulnerable, stop defining myself by what was done to me, and start defining myself by who I choose to become. It sounded simple, almost naive, but it was the hardest thing I'd ever committed to. Being alive, truly alive, required letting go of the armor I'd built, risking hurt again, opening myself to joy and pain and all the messy, complicated emotions I'd suppressed for so long. That's terrifying, Carolyn said, but she was smiling. It's also the healthiest thing I've ever heard you say. She was right. For 10 years, I'd been focused on survival, revenge, justice, building, helping, everything except the basic act of living fully as a flawed human, rather than a mission or a weapon. It was time to change that. My father died in prison 2 years later, a heart attack that the corrections officials said was quick and relatively painless. I didn't attend the funeral, didn't send flowers or condolences, felt nothing except the vague sadness that he'd never found the capacity for remorse or change. Nathan organized a small service, invited me through Carolyn, but I declined. Some chapters close without ceremony, without grand conclusions, just a quiet ending that doesn't resolve anything except the fact of ongoing pain. My mother reached out after my father's death, a long letter full of regrets and apologies and explanations that arrived on cream-colored stationery that was somehow perfectly her. I read it once, carefully, then put it in a drawer where I didn't have to look at it but knew where it was if I ever changed my mind about responding. I probably never would, but having the option felt important. The foundation established a scholarship in my Uncle David's name, funding law school for women who'd been incarcerated and wanted to fight for justice reform. The first recipient was a woman who'd served 6 years for a crime her boyfriend committed, who taught herself law in prison and passed the bar exam on her first try after release. Watching her accept a scholarship at our annual gala, I finally felt like the circle was complete, like David's destruction had been transformed into someone else's opportunity, his suffering into her success. I'm 42 now, sitting in my office at the foundation on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, writing this account of what happened to me and what I did about it. The rage that sustained me for so many years has faded to a manageable simmer, present but not consuming. The need for revenge has been replaced by the quieter satisfaction of meaningful work and genuine relationships. The person I became in prison, that hard, calculating survivor, she's still here, but softer now, more integrated with the person I was before and the person I'm still becoming. I won't lie and say I'm grateful for what happened, that being betrayed and imprisoned and forced to destroy my own family was somehow a gift. It wasn't. It was trauma, pure and simple, the kind that leaves scars no amount of therapy or justice or forgiveness can fully erase. But I survived it. And in surviving, I learned that I'm stronger and more resilient and more capable than I ever imagined. I learned that family is a choice, not just blood. I learned that justice is imperfect but worth fighting for. I learned that revenge feels emptier than expected, but building something good from tragedy feels right. Most importantly, I learned that you can survive the unsurvivable and still find reasons to keep living, to keep trying, to keep believing that tomorrow might be better than yesterday. The Emma Thornton Foundation continues growing, helping more women every year, pushing for policy changes and legal reforms that will prevent others from experiencing what I experienced. My grandmother's money, the fortune she carefully hid and preserved for my eventual revenge, funds it all, transformed from a weapon into a tool for healing. My Uncle David's story is taught in law schools now as a case study in psychological manipulation and corporate fraud. His death no longer a forgotten tragedy, but a cautionary tale. And me? I'm still here, still fighting, but also finally allowing myself to rest sometimes, to be imperfect, to need help, to be human rather than heroic. That's the real ending to this story, not the dramatic courtroom revelations or the family destruction or even the forgiveness. It's the quiet, undramatic fact that I survived, that I'm still here, that I chose to build rather than just destroy, and that every day I wake up and choose again to keep going, to keep helping, to keep living despite everything that tried to break me. That's the victory my grandmother planned for, the legacy my uncle deserved, and the justice I finally, imperfectly, found.